There is a ledger in the National Archives that lists every major donation made to the San Francisco earthquake relief effort in the spring and summer of 1906. It is not a dramatic document, it is a financial record. Names, amounts, dates, the dry accounting of a humanitarian campaign. The American Red Cross maintained it because the Red Cross needed to account for the $9 million it raised in the weeks after April 18, 1906, when an earthquake and the fires that followed it destroyed approximately 28,000 buildings, killed somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 people, and displaced roughly 225,000 residents of a city of 400,000. $9 million in 1906 was the largest single humanitarian fundraising total in American history to that point. It came from across the country and from foreign governments. Japan sent $244,000. Britain sent relief funds. The American public responded with a speed and generosity that the Red Cross called unprecedented. I looked at that ledger for a long time before I looked at anything else. Then, I put it next to something else. The San Francisco Relief and Red Cross Funds distribution records, which document not what was raised but what was distributed, to whom, in what amounts, and in what order. Those records are at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. They are not dramatic documents either. They are administrative, case numbers, household descriptions, award amounts, dates. When you put the two records on the same table and read them together, something happens that I have been trying to explain away for several months. The distribution was not proportional to need, it was proportional to something else. And the something else is in the records. To understand what those records show, you need to understand what San Francisco looked like on April 19, 1906, the day after the earthquake. The earthquake struck at 5:12 in the morning. The initial shaking lasted approximately 45 to 60 seconds. It was the shaking that collapsed buildings and severed gas lines and water mains. The fires started within minutes, dozens of them simultaneously, and they were what ultimately destroyed the city. The fire department had no water. The mains were broken. The fires burned for 3 days. When the fires were finally contained, the damage followed a specific geographic pattern. The working-class neighborhoods south of Market Street, called south of the Slot, were devastated. The Italian neighborhood of North Beach was largely destroyed. The manufacturing districts along the waterfront were gone, and Chinatown, the densely populated neighborhood at the base of Nob Hill that housed approximately 14,000 Chinese residents in roughly 12 square blocks, was completely destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. Every building gone. The Nob Hill mansions of the railroad and banking elite, the Crockers, the Huntingtons, the Stanfords, burned too. But those families had resources to rebuild. The residents of Chinatown, of south of the Slot, of North Beach did not. The relief effort was organized under a specific command structure. Mayor Eugene Schmitz and Brigadier General Frederick Funston, the military commander who had been authorized by the War Department to deploy federal troops to maintain order, established a committee of 50 to manage the emergency. The committee was composed of San Francisco's business elite. The specific membership is in the committee's own published records, available through the San Francisco Public Library's historical collection. Funston's letters from this period are in the National Archives under Record Group 94. They describe the relief operation in terms that are specific and revealing. He was managing not merely a humanitarian crisis, but a civic reconstruction project, and the two purposes were not always aligned. The obvious counter-argument, and I want to address it directly because it is the first thing a reasonable person thinks, is that distributing relief proportionally to a large, diverse, disaster-affected population is administratively difficult, and that disparities in distribution often reflect administrative capacity rather than intent. Communities with existing organizational infrastructure receive more resources because they can process them more efficiently. Communities without that infrastructure receive less, not because anyone decided they should, but because no one built the mechanism to reach them. That argument is correct. It is also the argument that explains what happened to Chinatown in 1906. Because if you follow that argument to its conclusion, it means that the 14,000 Chinese residents of San Francisco, who had less political representation, less access to the English-language bureaucratic processes that governed relief distribution, and less protection from a city government that had been trying to reduce the size of Chinatown for years before the earthquake, received less relief, not because anyone made a decision to harm them, but because the system that distributed relief was built by and for people who were not them. And that is precisely what the distribution records show. The San Francisco Relief and Red Cross funds distributed approximately $9 million in the months following the earthquake. The distribution was organized by a series of subcommittees that handled different categories of claimants. The Finance Committee, which oversaw the largest disbursements, was chaired by James Phelan, the former mayor of San Francisco, who had spent a significant portion of his political career advocating for restrictions on Chinese immigration, and who had, in 1901, led a successful campaign to prevent Chinese workers from rebuilding in certain areas of the city. Phelan's involvement in the relief distribution is documented in his own papers, which are at the Bancroft Library. His position on Chinese immigration and Chinese residency in San Francisco is documented in the San Francisco Chronicle archives and in his published speeches. Both sets of documents are available to researchers. The relief subcommittee that handled claims from Chinese residents operated separately from the main relief structure. It was smaller, slower, and controlled by different administrative mechanisms. The amounts it disbursed were not proportional to the population it served or the losses that population had suffered. Chinatown's 14,000 residents had lost everything. The neighborhood was a total loss. The per capita disbursement to Chinese claimants from the relief fund was significantly lower than the per capita disbursement to white claimants from the same fund. This is documented in the distribution records at the Bancroft Library. It is not an inference or an interpretation. It is in the accounting. Now, I want to tell you about what was being planned while the fires were still burning, because this is where the two purposes of the relief operation, humanitarian assistance and civic reconstruction, become impossible to separate. On April 21, 1906, 3 days after the earthquake, while approximately 200,000 displaced San Franciscans were still living in public parks and open spaces across the city, a group of city officials and business leaders met to discuss the reconstruction of Chinatown. The meeting is documented in the minutes of the Committee of 50, which are at the San Francisco Public Library. The discussion at that meeting concerned not whether to rebuild Chinatown, but whether to rebuild it in the same location. The argument made by several committee members was that the earthquake had created an opportunity, the word used in the minutes is opportunity, to relocate the Chinese population to a site outside the commercial center of the city. The location most frequently mentioned was a site near Hunter's Point on the southern edge of the city, far from the commercial waterfront that Chinatown's businesses had served. The relocation proposal had been circulating in San Francisco civic politics for years before the earthquake. The city's Chinese population had resisted it consistently. The earthquake, in the view of the committee members who raised the proposal on April 21st, had changed the calculus. The residents were displaced. The buildings were gone. The legal and social mechanisms that had prevented relocation when the neighborhood was occupied might not apply in the same way to an empty lot. The proposal did not succeed. The Chinese community, supported by the Chinese consulate and by the pressure of the Chinese government's diplomatic relationship with the United States, resisted the relocation successfully. Chinatown was rebuilt on its original site. The resistance to relocation is a story of successful community organization against significant institutional pressure, and it is documented in the Chinese consulate's communications with the State Department, which are in the National Archives. But the proposal itself, made on April 21, 1906, while the fires were still smoking, while the displaced population was sleeping in parks, is in the Committee of 50 Minutes. It is in the same archive as the relief distribution records. The opportunity and the distribution were being managed by the same people at the same time. Funston's letters from this period describe the military's role in the relief operation in terms that illuminate the specific priorities being balanced. The troops were maintaining order. Order in April 1906, San Francisco meant preventing looting, which the Army took seriously, but it also meant controlling the movement of the displaced population. Funston wrote to the War Department about the importance of directing relief resources in ways that would encourage the population to remain in the city rather than dispersing permanently. A city without residents could not rebuild its tax base. A city without a tax base could not service the bonds that financed the reconstruction. The relief operation was, in other words, also a population retention operation. And the population whose retention mattered most to the city's fiscal future was the population that would rebuild its commercial and manufacturing base, which was not the population of Chinatown. The relief ledger, the distribution records, the committee of 50 minutes, Funston's letters, Phelan's papers, none of these documents are hidden. They are in the Bancroft Library, the San Francisco Public Library, and the National Archives. They have been available to researchers for decades. They have simply never been placed on the same table and read in sequence. I placed them on the same table. What I read does not match the story in the textbook. In June of 1906, a man named Fong Ah-yu appeared at a relief distribution point in San Francisco to file a claim. He had owned a laundry in Chinatown. The business had been his family's livelihood for 11 years. The earthquake and the fires had destroyed it completely. The building, the equipment, the inventory, the business records. He had documentation of his ownership and his losses, prepared with the assistance of a Chinese community organization that had been helping residents navigate the relief bureaucracy. His claim was processed through the separate Chinese Claims Subcommittee. It took 4 months. The award he received was approximately 1/3 of the assessed loss value. A white-owned laundry business of comparable size that filed a claim through the main relief structure during the same period received awards that averaged closer to 60% of assessed loss value. The disparity is in the distribution records at the Bancroft Library. Fong Ah-yu's name is in those records. His claim number, his assessed loss, his award, and the processing time are all documented. I am not claiming that the subcommittee that processed his claim made a decision to give him less than his white counterparts. I am claiming that the structure of the relief operation, who ran which subcommittee, how quickly different categories of claims were processed, what documentation standards were applied, produced outcomes that followed a specific pattern. And that pattern is not consistent with a purely humanitarian distribution. Now, I want to tell you about the funding, because the funding is where the orphan train parallel becomes exact. The $9 million raised for San Francisco earthquake relief came from multiple sources. A significant portion came from corporate donors, railroad companies, banks, manufacturing firms. The specific donors are in the Red Cross ledger at the National Archives. The Southern Pacific Railroad donated $200,000. The Southern Pacific had extensive land grant holdings in California and was the dominant force in the state's political economy. Its interest in San Francisco's rapid recovery was not philanthropic. San Francisco was the railroad's primary Pacific terminus. A rebuilt San Francisco meant restored freight revenue. A dispersed or diminished San Francisco population meant reduced economic activity along routes the railroad depended on. The Southern Pacific also, in the weeks following the earthquake, offered reduced-rate transportation for relief supplies moving into the city and for displaced residents moving out of it. The specific rates and the specific routes are in the Interstate Commerce Commission records, which are in the National Archives. The railroad was simultaneously a major donor to the Relief Fund, a provider of subsidized transportation for relief operations, and the primary economic beneficiary of the city's reconstruction. These roles are not incompatible, but they are not independent either. The banks that donated to the Relief Fund had similar structural interests. San Francisco's financial district had been destroyed. The bank's vaults had survived. Vault technology was sophisticated enough by 1906 to protect the contents even in a major fire. But their offices, their records infrastructure, and their customer-facing operations were gone. The rapid restoration of the city's commercial infrastructure was a direct financial interest of the institutions that funded its relief. A relief operation funded by the institutions that most needed the city rebuilt quickly, organized by a committee of the city's business elite, and distributed through mechanisms that prioritized commercially significant populations over politically marginalized ones, is not a humanitarian operation that also had some economic dimensions. It is an economic operation that wore the language and the organizational form of humanitarian relief. That is what the documents suggest. Let me be specific about what the documents say and what they do not say. The documents say the relief was distributed unequally, with Chinese claimants receiving less per capita than white claimants from the same fund. The relocation of Chinatown was proposed by members of the same committee that oversaw relief distribution 3 days after the earthquake. The major corporate donors had direct financial interests in the city's rapid reconstruction. The military commander described the relief operation in terms that included population retention as an explicit objective. The documents do not say anyone sat in a room and decided to use the earthquake as an opportunity to harm the Chinese community. The documents do not establish that the unequal distribution was the result of a deliberate policy of discrimination rather than a structural outcome of the administrative mechanisms in place. The distinction matters, but it does not change the outcome for Fong Ah-yu. I want to tell you about Catherine Sellers, the orphan train placement agent who asked whether it was appropriate to keep sending children to a community where they were being used as labor rather than raised as children, and whose supervisor told her to proceed because the receiving families were satisfied. The San Francisco relief operation had its Catherine Sellers too. Her name was Mary Kelly. She was a Red Cross volunteer who worked in the relief camps in Golden Gate Park in the summer of 1906, processing claims from displaced residents. Her letters from this period, written to her sister in Chicago and preserved in a private collection that was donated to the Chicago History Museum in 1987, describe the relief operation from the ground level in ways that the official reports do not. Kelly writes about Chinese claimants who arrived at the main relief distribution points and were directed to a separate process. She writes about the documentation requirements that were applied differently to different categories of claimants. She writes about families she knew were eligible for relief who did not receive it because they could not navigate the bureaucratic process in English. She does not frame what she is describing as discrimination. She describes it as inefficiency. She uses the word unfortunate 3 times in the letters that address this subject. She does not resign. She does not file a formal complaint. She continues working. Her letters are in the Chicago History Museum. They have been there since 1987. They are available to researchers who request them. What Kelly described as inefficiency and what the distribution records document as outcome are the same thing looked at from different positions. The efficiency of a system is measured against its objectives. If the objective was equitable distribution of relief based on need, the system was inefficient. If the objective was rapid reconstruction of the city's commercial infrastructure, with particular attention to the neighborhoods and populations most valuable to that reconstruction, the system worked with considerable precision. The burned towns needed labor. That was the orphan train. The railroad needed a rebuilt terminus. The banks needed a restored financial district. The city's elite needed a reconstruction that preserved their neighborhoods and their economic position. The earthquake had created, as the Committee of 50 Minutes described it, an opportunity. The relief operation was how that opportunity was organized and funded. The $9 million was the mechanism, the distribution was the implementation, and the language of humanitarian relief was what made it possible to organize all of this without triggering the legal and political response that an explicitly economic operation would have provoked. 4 problems. 1 solution dressed in the language of rescue. Now, I want to tell you about what Chinatown's resistance looked like, because the resistance matters and because it is in the record too. The Chinese Consul General in San Francisco, Chung Pao-si, wrote to the State Department within days of the earthquake warning that any attempt to relocate Chinatown would be interpreted by the Chinese government as a violation of treaty obligations. His letter is in the State Department records at the National Archives. The Chinese community organized. Chinatown's property owners, working through the Chinese Six Companies, the community's primary civic organization, hired American lawyers, and began the legal process of asserting property rights to the land that Chinatown had occupied. The legal strategy is documented in the San Francisco Superior Court records from 1906 and 1907. The combination of diplomatic pressure from the Chinese government and legal action by the community's property owners made the relocation proposal politically and legally untenable within weeks of its initial proposal. By August 1906, the city had effectively abandoned the relocation effort. Chinatown was rebuilt on its original site. By 1908, it was largely restored. The resistance succeeded. The records of the resistance, the consul general's letters, the legal filings, the 6 companies' correspondence, are in the National Archives, the San Francisco Superior Court Archives, and the Bancroft Library. The resistance succeeded because the Chinese community had resources that most disaster-affected populations do not have: a foreign government's diplomatic backing, an organized civic infrastructure, and property rights that were legally documented and enforceable. The residents of south of the Slot, the working-class neighborhood south of Market Street, that was also devastated, had none of those things. They had no diplomatic backing, no organized civic infrastructure with the political connections required to resist institutional pressure, and in many cases, no property rights because they were renters rather than owners. Their neighborhood was rebuilt too, but more slowly, with less of the relief fund, and without the political visibility that Chinatown's battle for survival had generated. The distribution records show this too. South of the Slot claimants received less per capita than claimants from the Western Addition, the neighborhood that housed many of the city's middle-class white residents, and their claims took longer to process. 3 neighborhoods, 3 different outcomes from the same relief fund. The differences track with political representation, economic value to the city's reconstruction, and access to the bureaucratic mechanisms that govern distribution. The relief ledger is in the National Archives. The distribution records are at the Bancroft Library. The Committee of 50 Minutes are at the San Francisco Public Library. Funston's letters are in Record Group 94. Phelan's papers are at the Bancroft Library. The Consul General's letters are in the State Department records. Mary Kelly's letters are at the Chicago History Museum. None of these documents are hidden. They have been available for decades. They have simply never been placed on the same table and read in sequence. The $9 million was the largest humanitarian fundraising total in American history to that point. The people who raised it called it charity. The people who organized its distribution called it relief. The people who funded it called it civic duty. The distribution records call it something else. They call it, in the dry language of accounting, what it was: a set of decisions about who got what, made by specific people with specific interests, in the aftermath of a disaster that had created, as the Committee of 50 described it, an opportunity. The children on the orphan train platforms never knew enough to ask where they had come from or why they had been sent there. The residents of Chinatown asked. The Consul General asked on their behalf. The lawyers asked in the Superior Court. The property owners asked through the 6 companies. They got an answer. The other neighborhoods did not have the resources to ask. The documents know what the answer would have been. The San Francisco Relief and Red Cross Funds distribution records are at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. The collection is available to researchers by appointment. Finding aids are available through the Bancroft Library's online catalog. The Committee of 50 Minutes are at the San Francisco History Center at the San Francisco Public Library. The collection includes meeting minutes, correspondence, and subcommittee reports from the 1906 Reconstruction period. General Funston's letters from the earthquake period are in the National Archives under Record Group 94, Adjutant General's Office Records. The State Department records containing the Consul General's communications are in Record Group 59. James Phelan's papers, including his correspondence during the Reconstruction period, are at the Bancroft Library. Mary Kelly's letters are at the Chicago History Museum. The collection is searchable through the museum's online finding aid. The Red Cross donation ledger from 1906 is in the National Archives. The $9 million raised, the donors, and the amounts are all documented. The documents were always there. What was missing was someone willing to place them on the same table. Subscribe, because next week we open another file.